Good evening. Afternoon, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Jerry. Most of us have somebody in our life that we could point to as our pillar of faith. Somebody who helped guide us spiritually. Maybe it was our parents. Maybe we were brought up in the church. But maybe we weren't. Maybe it was a friend. Or maybe we stumbled upon the church someday and someone took us in under their wing and helped nurture us and teach us God's Word. I'll tell you a story about a man back in Homa. His name is Anthony, and he was raised Catholic, and he began to study the Bible on his own one day and realized there were some things that were missing. And for many years, he searched, and I mean for 6 or 7 years, he searched diligently for the one true church. And he came to the church in Homa one day, and David introduced himself, and he said, "My name is Anthony, and I'm looking for the one true church." And David began to study with him and took him under his wing and became a friend. And Anthony is a faithful member of the church today. Works diligently in the church, teaches class, leads singing, does all kinds of other work for events that the church does. It's a wonderful story. And I'm sure that all of us can point to somebody like that. And maybe it's not somebody who would ever teach a gospel meeting or a ladies' day or anything, but it's somebody that we can point to as the person who helped make us the person we are spiritually. For me, that's my grandparents, Ed and Velma Watson. You see, I was raised in a home with a wayward father and a non-Christian mother. But my grandfather was an elder in the Lord's church for almost 40 years, and my grandmother his loving and faithful wife, a woman who loved God and His church. There are a couple things I want us to think about today, lessons that I learned from my grandparents, spiritual lessons that I learned from them that I think we can all take and apply to our own lives. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, at verse 5, Paul writes to Timothy, "I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now, I am sure, dwells in you as well." First lesson I want us to take from my grandparents today is Matthew 26, verses 36 through 46, the idea of tough love. There are two particular stories I want to tell. One is a little more humorous than the other. My grandmother became very ill at a certain point and had to use one of those motorized chairs. And when I was about 16, I acted like several other teenagers act like when they get to that age, and began to say yes and no without the ma'am or sir attached. Exactly. And one day I said this to my grandmother. I said yeah and not yes ma'am. And she said, "If you say that one more time without the ma'am attached, I'm going to run you over with this chair." And you better believe I never said it like that again. But around that same age, I had a friend who invited me to a movie on a Sunday morning. And I'm very embarrassed still to this day to say that I chose to go to the movies instead of attending worship that morning. Now, I think the world of my grandfather. In fact, if I could live my life exactly like his, I'd be okay. Because he's one of those people that can easily say, "Imitate me as I also imitate Christ," as Paul said. And when I left the movies that morning, I had a voicemail on my phone from Ed Watson. And he didn't yell. He didn't sound angry. He just said something that still sticks with me, and I can hear it very vividly today. "I can't tell you how disappointed I am in you." And for me to have disappointed Ed Watson was something I will never forgive myself for. But more importantly, I let Jesus down that morning, and He was reminding me of that. In Matthew chapter 26, we read it this morning. But Jesus gives some tough love to the apostles. He says, Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And talking with him, Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And then in verses 69 through 75 of the same chapter, we see Peter's denial of Jesus, what Peter would probably point to as the low point of his life, especially in the ministry. And after the rooster crows, Mark's account says that Jesus looked upon Peter. I want you to put yourself in Peter's shoes. As the Christ, who you just moments before claimed you loved and said you would go to the cross with him, you just denied knowing him. And he looks upon you as you hear that rooster crow and realize that the prophecy he foretold earlier had come true. That was the disappointment I felt that day when my grandfather called me. And he gave me some tough love. He told me that he was disappointed in me because he loved me. Jesus told the apostles what he did in Matthew 26 because he loved them. Every rebuke that comes about from Jesus, from the apostles, and Paul's epistles, it's because of the love that these men had for the people that they were trying to reach. Because if they didn't love them, they wouldn't say anything to them. Parents, it's like when you discipline your child. If you didn't love them, you wouldn't discipline them, right? But you do love them, and so you do discipline them. And when they do wrong, you correct them because you don't want to see them going down a certain path. And so you discipline them. Jesus was the same way. My grandparents were the same. Number two, another lesson that I learned from my grandparents was faith through difficult times. Turn over to the book of Job with me. It's a story that we all know. My grandmother, when I was around 12 years old, began to get very sick. She had a series of blood infections and cancer and other various ailments and illnesses. And it was a slow progression, but it got worse and worse throughout the years. Several times we didn't think she was going to make it, and she made it, and she went back home, and then she was back in the hospital soon after. It was very difficult. But one day I remember very vividly walking into the hospital room. It was a Sunday. My grandfather had gone to grab lunch for him and my grandmother. And I walked in, and my grandmother was crying, and I thought something was wrong, and I told her I could get the nurse or call Papa or whatever she needed me to do. And she said something that really amazed me. She said, "Is God upset with me for not being at services this morning?" Now, this woman is sick, and she had just been in ICU not long before, and there's no way she can get out of the hospital. And she was worried that she disappointed God because she wasn't at church service that morning. And it really made me wonder if I have that same attitude about worship. Of course, I told her that God was pleased with her attitude, I was sure. But that was my grandmother. She never lost her faith through the difficult times, and she went through some very difficult times. In Job, we read about how Satan goes to God, and God says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And Job says, Satan says, "You have this protective bubble around Job. But if you take that away, he will curse you. He will sin. He will stumble. And God says, all right, try it. And Job goes through a series of tests unlike, I would imagine, nearly anybody has ever had to face. He loses his family, he loses his possessions, and he suffers a great deal of health problems. And yet in Job chapter 1, verse 22, the Bible records, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. We will face great trials and temptations and tribulations in this life. It could be us getting very sick. It could be somebody we love. It could be financial problems, job problems. It could be one of our children maybe falling away after they've left the house. All of that is extraordinarily difficult. But if we look to people like Job, we can keep faith in God. We can continue to work to make ourselves better, help others, lead them to Christ. But Job is a great example of someone who, whatever happens, remained faithful, and we can have that example as well. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 16 through 18. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. What an amazing thought. Paul is saying to the church in Corinth, look, your outer self may be dying, you may be wasting away, you may be decaying, but this affliction is only going to last for a moment. Momentary affliction, he says in verse 17. And all this momentary affliction is preparing us for one day when all of that will go away. It's preparing us for a day of no more tears or suffering or sickness or sorrow. And we look to the things that are, we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. That was the attitude my grandmother had. She was looking to the things unseen. She kept faith despite her various illnesses and tribulations. And I have no doubt that all of it was worth it. In fact, David at her funeral, that was his central message, that if she could speak to us today, she would say it was worth it. Paul, I imagine he's another one who could say it was worth it. He went through so much as an apostle of Jesus Christ, but he could look back and say it was worth it. I learned a great deal of humility too. There is a congregation about 30 minutes from Houma, the Thibodeau Bypass Church of Christ, and the preacher there at the time of this story was a former elder at Houma. And I went there to talk to their youth group about the youth retreat that we do in Houma. And they, after Bible class, Ed Richardson was the preacher's name, he said, Joel, I want you to preach this morning. And I hadn't known that he was going to ask me to preach. I hadn't really prepared anything, so I was sort of on the spot. And I said, okay. And he began to introduce me to the members. There were about 50 or 60 of them. And every time he would introduce me, he'd say, this is Joel Watson, Ed Watson's grandson. This is Joel Watson, Ed Watson's grandson. And every time he did that, those people said, oh, we just love Brother Ed. We love Ed Watson. And I was thinking, are we talking about the same Ed Watson? No. But my grandfather, apparently, he didn't tell anybody this, and I had never heard it, but he had gone in when they were building their building and done all the electrical work and AC installation completely free of charge. Bought the materials and installed it all without a single cost to the church. And those people were so appreciative of this man doing that for them. And when I went to tell him what had happened, what these people were saying, he sort of did that thing where he was embarrassed and he began to mumble and, oh, it wasn't a big deal. he acted like it didn't really matter. And when we had a lunch for him after he had resigned as an elder, after Grandma passed away, all of these people got up and said such wonderful things about him, and he was just so embarrassed. He was so humble. He didn't want to take any credit. And there are so many people that I know can look at my grandfather and say that he was the one that helped bring them to Christ. But he would never take a single ounce of credit because he knows that God deserves all the glory. That's the way he lives his life. James 4, verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. He's not someone who would take all kinds of credit, because he knows that one day, if he humbles himself like he has, like the way he's lived his life, God will exalt him before every person who has ever lived. Humility is such an important factor in a Christian's life because it allows us to serve others. It allows us to put others before ourselves. And that opens the door for us to convert people, to help people, to be a light to those around us. I know that we can all think of someone that we can learn lessons from, that we can take advice from, that we can look back on and point to them as the people that helped make us the spiritual people that we are today. My grandparents were that for me. I hope that you reflect on somebody in your life like that. I hope if they're still alive that you call them or write them a card or just drop them a line and thank them. But more importantly than that even, let's thank Jesus Christ for the opportunity to be members of His church. Because without Him, all the humility and all the tough love and all the faithfulness wouldn't really make much of a difference. Because without Him dying, being buried and resurrected on the third day, we would have no hope. Without that great sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the Son of God who came to earth and lived as one of us and freely gave Himself, all of this wouldn't matter. Thank God that His Son came to this earth. Thank God for the church. But let's take these attributes we talked about today and this morning and apply them to our lives as we go out this week. Let's think about if that person that we considered in the beginning of our lesson, that person who helped make us who we are, if we lived like we are living right now, would they be pleased or would they be disappointed? If we continue to live the way we're living right now, would Jesus Christ look at us and say, "Well done," or would He say, "Depart from me"? And let's make sure that we're living a life that one day Jesus will be able to say to us, when we meet Him in the clouds and He's judging the entire world, that He can tell us, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Let us live a life where we're humble on this earth, but we can be exalted in front of all who've ever lived. If you're not living that life, I hope that you will make the change today. If you're not a Christian, we want to talk to you about how to become one. And if you are and you've not lived right, then let's make that right today. Let's live a life that is pleasing to God and one in which Jesus will smile down upon. If you need the prayers of this church for any reason, we ask that you come as together we stand and as we sing.